Time feels so immediate. The breath in your chest, the light in the room, the sound of your own heartbeat. Yet everything you call now is already slipping away. The light you see left its source before you looked. The voice you just heard reached you after nerves and synapses delayed it. Even the decision you think you just made was set in motion before you felt it. In this journey, we follow those hidden delays from war rooms and deep oceans to the brain's slow spark of thought. To discover how far behind the present we really are, you'll find out why stars can be long dead when we wish on their glow. Why a photograph is always a memorial, and why the live world on your screen is never truly live. The present isn't where you think it is, but understanding that changes everything. If you close your eyes and tap your finger gently against the tabletop, you might think you feel the touch the instant it happens. But the truth is more complicated and a little unsettling. Long before you were aware of the movement, a cluster of specialized nerve endings in the skin sent an electrical signal racing up your arm toward the spinal cord, where it leaped from one neuron to the next and finally reached the brain's sensory cortex. This path is fast, but not instant. A typical impulse moves at something like 150 feet per second along the fastest fibers. Yet even at that speed, the journey takes a measurable fraction of time. Once inside the brain, the signal is sorted, mapped, compared against memory, and then delivered into the fragile space of conscious experience. By the time you say to yourself, "I felt that," the world has already moved on. The same is true for what you see. Light reflecting off your hand enters the cornea, bends through the lens, and lands on the photoreceptor cells of the retina. But the information does not leap whole into awareness. It is coded into tiny electrical patterns and sent along the optic nerve toward the back of the brain, where millions of neurons break the scene into edges, color and motion, and then rebuild it as a single picture. Experiments first done in the 1960s by researchers like Benjamin Libet showed how small the lag can be, often just a few hundred milliseconds, but still enough that every sight you believe is present tense is, in fact, the past by the time it reaches you. Even sound, which we imagine as immediate, travels with its own quiet delay. The crack of a door closing across the room is nothing more than pressure waves in air that push and pull against the delicate drum of the ear. From there, the vibrations become nerve signals, winding through the cochlea and the auditory nerve before they reach the temporal lobe. A loud clap 15 feet away takes about 15 milliseconds to reach your ears. The brain then needs another short beat to make sense of pitch and volume. So, when you hear a sudden shout, the muscles of your body are already reacting slightly before the full conscious thought forms. It is strange to realize that this built-in delay means you never inhabit the razor's edge you call now. The moment you believe you're standing in has already slipped away. Scientists sometimes call this the perceptual present. A small window of time the brain stitches together so you can act as if the world is continuous. Without this stitching, life would feel jagged and chaotic. Instead, the brain quietly smooths events into a single flow. By the time you think you caught a ball, you're acting on where it was a split second before. The catch only works because your brain predicted where it would go. Consider driving a car on a crowded highway. Your eyes sweep the lanes ahead, your hands hover on the wheel. But everything you see is slightly old news. The brake lights that just flashed already belong to the past. Yet your body can still respond because your nervous system has learned to anticipate. Athletes rely on the same trick. Baseball players, for instance, have only 0.4 of a second to swing at a 90-mile-per-hour fastball. The swing begins before the ball even leaves the pitcher's hand. A movement based on prediction, not real-time vision. Even the sense of self, that quiet voice saying, "I am here," comes after the fact. The famous experiments by Libet in 1983 suggested that the brain initiates voluntary actions before we feel we've chosen them. Electrodes placed on the scalp picked up a small electrical wave, the readiness potential, beginning fractions of a second before subjects reported the conscious decision to flex a finger. Later studies refined and debated these findings. The pattern remains. Choice is prepared just before it is experienced. If this sounds unsettling, it may help to know that the delay is part of survival. The The brain acts like a careful editor, holding back a moment, so it can combine many signals and present a stable, usable picture of reality. Without that brief pause, you would be assaulted by raw, unfiltered sensations. It's the reason you can walk without stumbling even though nerve impulses from your feet arrive, slightly out of sync with the shifting ground. There is poetry in this hidden gap. Imagine standing in the Nevada desert at dusk, watching the sun slide behind the ridges. What you see left the sun's surface more than 8 minutes ago. The colors painting the sand are not the sun as it is, but as it was. Even here on Earth, the present is an aftermage. The eyes, the ears, the skin, the great silent machinery of the brain are always catching up. And yet, though we live in what might be called the just was, we do not feel lost or behind. Our minds weave the tiny delays into a smooth ribbon of time. We build lives, tell stories, and take comfort in a present that isn't truly present, but good enough to stand on. Somewhere deep in the cells and fibers, the body whispers what happened a heartbeat ago and calls it now. If you step outside on a clear evening and look toward the fading line of the horizon, where the last orange light of the day slips away, you might think you are watching something that is happening right now. But the scene above you is already a memory traveling at the speed of light. The sunlight that warms your skin and colors the clouds left the surface of the sun about 8 minutes and 20 seconds earlier, which means every gentle glow that reaches your eyes belongs to a past moment. The rays began their journey deep inside the solar core, where nuclear fusion has been quietly at work for billions of years, and though the photons were created in an instant, their path outward through the dense plasma of the sun's interior is slow and chaotic. Some scientists estimate that it can take thousands, even millions, of years for a single particle of light to finally break free from that fiery maze and race into the emptiness of space, only to spend a final 8 minutes crossing the 93 million miles to Earth. It is easy to forget this when we speak of sunrise and sunset, because we tie those words to our clocks and our sense of immediate presence. Yet when you stand at the edge of the sea and watch the sun sink below the waterline, what you are really seeing is a star as it looked more than 8 minutes ago. If something unimaginable were to happen to the sun at this very instant, if it were to vanish or flare, we would continue to feel its warmth and see its light for several long, silent minutes before the truth arrived. That delay has been known for centuries. Ulrachmer, a Danish astronomer in 1676, was the first to measure the speed of light with some accuracy by watching Jupiter's moon Io disappear and reappear on a schedule that shifted depending on Earth's distance from Jupiter. His calculations hinted that light was fast, but not infinite. And the idea that what we see is never quite now began to take root. Once you know this, the night sky changes. Every star you see is a letter sent long ago. The bright blue-white point of Sirius and Canis Major is shining from just over 8 light-years away. The red ember of Betelgeuse in Orion is more than 600 light-years distant. The pale gleam of Deneb in Cygnus left before the age of the printing press, perhaps when Chaucer was still writing in England. When you look at the Andromeda Galaxy, faint and misty to the naked eye, but clear in long exposure photographs, you are seeing light that began its crossing 2.5 million years ago. When early humans were shaping stone tools on African plains and had yet to dream of cities or ships, the universe is a vast archive of delayed messages, and the night is its reading room. Even dramatic cosmic events reach us with their own long pause. Supernova 1987A, the brilliant star that appeared suddenly in the southern hemisphere sky, erupted in the Large Magellanic Cloud about 168,000 years before it was spotted by astronomers in Chile and Australia. When they watched that dying star's light flare and fade in February 1987, they were witnessing a death that happened before modern humans had even crossed into Europe. Solar flares that can disrupt radio signals and power grids on Earth leave the sun's surface and take more than 8 minutes to arrive. Scientists at NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory watch them as warnings, knowing there is a narrow window before the particles reach our world. Even the comforting twinkle of ordinary stars is proof of distance and delay, their shimmer shaped by air, currents and atmospheric movement long after the photons themselves began there. Flight this lag is not just an abstract thought, but a physical reality woven into daily life. When the Great Carrington event occurred in 1859, an immense solar storm that lit up telegraph lines and set papers ablaze in offices from London to Boston. The first brilliant outburst on the sun had already happened 8 minutes before its light was seen, and the charged particles that caused the auroras needed more than a day to reach Earth. Early astronomers could only watch and take notes, helpless to act on a delay they understood, but could not escape. There is a quiet humility in realizing that the sky is an ancient photograph. Every time you watch a meteor shower like the Perseids in August or the Geminids in December, you are seeing grains of dust burn in the present, while the parent comets that shed them may have passed long before recorded history. The gentle arc of the Milky Way overhead is the combined glow of billions of stars, many of which may no longer exist as you see them, their true fate hidden until their final light finishes its journey. And yet, despite the distances and the waiting, we find connection in this slow conversation. Telescopes like Hubble and the new James Webb Space Telescope gather light so old it left its source when Earth was still a young, volcanic place. In 1995, when Hubble captured the famous pillars of creation in the Eagle Nebula, the light was about 7,000 years on its way. Today, some of those towers of gas have already been torn apart by stellar winds, but their past glory is just reaching our eyes. Understanding this does not make the night colder. Instead, it makes it richer. You are never standing in a perfect present, but you are surrounded by messages from across time and space, each one proof that the universe keeps speaking even when you are late to hear it. The last ray of the setting sun, the starlight spilling across a quiet field, the faint glow from galaxies too far to imagine, they are all reminders that the now you know is stitched from light that traveled far and long to find you, if you have ever stood in a deep canyon and shouted your own name just to hear it return. You know something about how slowly the world speaks back? The cry seems to fly outward in an instant, but the pause before it returns is a small, measurable distance of time and space. The voice strikes the sheer rock faces, leaps across ledges and hidden alcoves, and only then comes tumbling home, reshaped and delayed. The experience is strange and slightly magical. Yet it is only physics at work. Sound travels through air at about 1,125 feet per second, far slower than the speed of light that lets you see the cliff walls long before you hear them reply. That gap is why we count seconds after a flash of lightning. To guess how far away the storm is, 5 seconds between flash and thunder means the bolt is about a mile off. And it is why every thunderclap is really a story of something that already happened long before scientific charts explain this. People who moved through wild, empty spaces learned to read echoes as part of survival. Boatmen who rode the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon in the late 19th century, men like John Wesley Powell and the crews of his 1869 expedition, spent long days among walls that rose thousands of feet above the current. Their voices and the splash of their oars came back to them again and again. Sometimes once, sometimes layered, each return shaped by a hidden bend or hollow. Those echoes were not just entertainment. They warned of narrow turns ahead, helped estimate distance, and gave some sense of the enormous space they could not see beyond the next corner. In their journals, there are lines about the sound of rushing water reaching them before the danger of a rapid came into view. The river's roar folded and returned by the canyon until it seemed to whisper secrets from downstream, far from desert stone. Arctic whalers once used echoes too, though their environment was made of ice and sea rather than sandstone. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, before sonar and satellite maps, men steering wooden ships through frozen channels would fire rifles into the fog or pound on the hull with heavy mallets, listening for how the sound came back. Icebergs, though silent and pale, gave themselves away in the echo, a dull, quick slap of noise if close, a stretched, faint answer if far. Inuit hunters, with skills passed from generation to generation, knew these cues intimately. They could judge where solid ice gave way to leads of open water, by the way sound changed and traveled across the frozen surface. Divers who explore underwater caves today work with echoes as well, though in their case the sounds move not through air but through water, which carries vibration faster yet still not instantaneously. Modern cave explorers, like those who mapped Florida's Waukulla Springs or Mexico's vast Yucatan cenotes, learn to tap on tanks or use small sonar pings to feel their way through black tunnels. Each return sound is delayed, bent by passages and chambers they cannot see, giving a living map of stone and water. One diver once described it as hearing a ghost ahead of you. The future space calling back from the past? Everyday life is full of these small delays, though most of us no longer notice. At a summer baseball game in Chicago or Tokyo, the crack of the bat seems to match the swing, yet the sound is already trailing behind the sight, reaching you after the ball is in flight. At a 4th of July fireworks show, the blooms of color arrive in silence. Then, a beat later, the boom rolls across the park. The delay can be long enough to feel eerie on a wide plain or across a lake, where the far side answers seconds after you speak, as if time itself stuttered. There is an odd poetry in this slow conversation between world and ear. When we say a space has good acoustics, what we really mean is that its delays and reflections feel harmonious, the lag pleasing rather than harsh. Old cathedrals in Europe, Notre Dame in Paris, before the fire of 2019, or St. Paul's in London were built with soaring vaults that hold sound and let it return softly, turning a single voice into a floating choir. Opera houses and concert halls are tuned for this too. From Vienna's Musikverein, finished in 1870, to the grand wooden stages of New York's Carnegie Hall, every note you hear in such places is both present and past, first born at the singer's lips or the violin's string, then wandering outward, bouncing and bending, before it arrives whole to your seat. This constant lateness does not make the world feel broken. Rather, it gives it depth. A canyon without echo would feel dead. A city without the murmur of distant footsteps would seem unreal. A sea that never answered back would be terrifying in its emptiness. Even in intimate spaces, a child calling from another room, a friend's laughter carried down a hallway. The small lag between sound leaving and arriving is part of the rhythm of living. Once you notice it, the illusion of now feels more fragile, yet also more beautiful. You live surrounded by returning messages, each one proof that life stretches out and curves back. The whisper you hear is always a little older than you think. The thunder is memory following lightning. The echo in the canyon is you, but not you as you are now, you as you were seconds ago. And still, despite the gap, the world holds together. We answer back to ourselves across stone and water and air, and in that answering, we find orientation, safety. And wonder, place a hand flat against your chest and wait for the steady movement beneath the skin. It feels direct and immediate, but the sensation you notice is already in the past. Each heartbeat begins deep inside the body, a tiny electrical signal rising in the sinoatrial node near the top of the right atrium, then sweeping across the heart's muscle fibers, first pulling the atria tight, and then, a fraction of a second later, forcing the thick walls of the ventricles to contract and send blood surging into arteries. Only after that pulse has been pushed forward does the wave of pressure travel into the great vessels and on through narrower and narrower branches until, finally, a minute expansion reaches the fingertips and the small sensors in your skin. The nerves there convert that pressure into electrical impulses that climb toward the spinal cord and the brain, which, after another moment of processing, gives you the quiet knowledge that something inside you just moved. The instant you think, "I feel my heart," the beat has already happened. Modern instruments make this delay visible in a way ancient physicians could only guess. In hospitals and clinics, the electrocardiogram, often shortened to EKG or ECG, draws its jagged green line across a monitor. The spike you see on the screen represents the electrical wave that set the heart contracting a moment earlier. It is an echo of an event already finished. Doctors and nurses know this instinctively. They watch the pattern appear, They count the intervals between spikes. But they also know that what they are seeing is not the present tense muscle squeeze, but the trace it left behind. In intensive care units, the beeping that reassures families standing at a bedside is built on this delay. It is a sound produced after the cell's spark has passed, centuries before these machines. Healers relied on waiting and listening, aware in some wordless way that the body's signals travel more slowly than the events that cause them. Ancient Chinese physicians wrote about the pulse as early as the Han Dynasty, scribing 30 or more subtle varieties they believed revealed the state of the organs. They trained themselves to feel for long silent moments before naming what they found. In Greece, Hippocrates and later Galen urged students to measure life by the throb, yet even they taught patients a pulse had to be observed, counted against sand or water clocks, and compared with breathing. Medieval doctors in Europe tied knots and string to mark rhythm, timing the heart with slow candles or dripping water because there was no faster way to catch what had already gone by. The 16th century French surgeon Ambroise Paré wrote that the physician must attend the pulse with quiet thought, acknowledging how it spoke of what had just occurred rather than what was happening now. There is something profoundly human in this small lag between action and awareness. Our entire circulatory system depends on trust in events we cannot feel as they occur. In 1628, William Harvey, the English physician who first described blood's closed-loop motion, wrote about the heart's hidden labor pumping long before the mind could know it. He proved with careful dissection and experiment that the heart worked like a mechanical engine, sending a ceaseless stream through arteries and veins, but he also recognized that sensation lagged behind function. The body's survival was built on work done out of sight and ahead of thought. In modern emergency rooms, those seconds can mean everything. A paramedic checks a carotid artery on an unconscious patient, waiting for a faint thump that may be 1 or 2 beats behind what the heart just did. Defibrillators deliver their jolt to reset electrical chaos. Then everyone waits, not because they expect instant news, because it takes a moment for a fresh wave to reach fingers or machine. The green line spikes after the cells have already begun to fire in order again. When cardiologists interpret Holter monitor data or study long strips of ECG paper, they are reading history measured in heartbeats. It's not the true present. This small gap shapes everyday experience too. When you run up a hill and stop at the top, breathing hard, the racing you feel is your body catching up to the sudden demand for oxygen made several steps ago. If you pause and hold a lover's hand to feel their pulse, you are touching an event that has already passed through their chest and out into their veins. Yet this delay does not separate us. Instead, it creates a steady rhythm we can trust, a kind of living echo that reminds us the body is always just ahead of our awareness, but still faithful to its work. There is an almost meditative power in noticing this. Monks in Kyoto have long practiced heart listening as part of Zazen, placing attention on the slow pulse behind the sternum, understanding not that they are present with the beat, but that they are observing life a moment after it occurs. Yoga traditions speak of the same quiet space, teaching that perception rides slightly behind breath and blood. Far from being a flaw, this delay gives the brain room to weave signals from many sources into a single, stable picture of self. Even when technology has pushed us closer to immediacy, fingertip pulse oximeters flashing heart rates, watches tracking every rise and fall, the truth remains the same. These numbers are reports from the near past. The heart is already somewhere ahead, pounding and adapting while we watch its footprint. To live with that knowledge is to live with humility and awe, aware that the most vital force in your body is always a few steps in front of you, pulling you along. While you follow its trace, like a traveler reading footprints in sand, on a clear day at sea, there is a quiet trick the earth plays. One so ordinary that sailors came to trust it even as it reminded them of distance and delay. Because the planet is curved, an approaching ship does not appear all at once. The topmost parts emerge first, masts and sails floating like ghosts long before the solid weight of the hull can be seen. For centuries, mariners watched these slow arrivals with a mix of relief and caution, knowing that what they saw was both real and not yet fully present. The line of the horizon is a boundary not just of sight but of time, a place where events are slightly ahead of what the eye can know. A lookout posted high on a mainmast could give warning minutes before the deck crew below saw anything at all. And in those minutes, danger or salvation might turn. During the great age of sail, when ships like HMS Victory under Admiral Nelson, or the Fast, American clippers of the 1850s roamed the oceans, this delay shaped every watch and every plan. Crews depended on men in crow's nests straining against wind and sun. Eyes narrowed against glare, because they could see farther and therefore see earlier. Even so, what they glimpsed belonged to a past moment. A ship spotted as a speck of canvas might have altered course minutes before. A squall behind a haze could already be moving faster than it appeared. Naval battles often hinged on this uncertain timing. At Trafalgar in 1805, signal flags went up across fleets while distances still swallowed details. Orders written on deck described enemy formations already shifting on the horizon. And captains acted on a picture drawn from light minutes old. Coastal communities built lighthouses for similar reasons. Towers of stone and flame meant to bridge the gap between where a ship was and where its watchers hoped it would soon arrive. From the Eddystone Lighthouse off Cornwall, rebuilt in 1759 after storms destroyed earlier versions, to the towering Cape Hatteras light on the Outer Banks first lit in December 1870. These beacons pushed visibility farther out, but they did not remove the lag. A keeper might watch a vessel's lights appear on the Black Sea and know that by the time they were seen, the ship's own crew had already passed the point of no return. Distress signals by lantern or flare traveled quickly once lit. Yet even that small delay could mean a vessel was closer to rocks than the answering rescuer guessed. When steam replaced sail and then wireless telegraphy followed, mariners believed they were stepping closer to true immediacy. A ship could tap out its presence in dots and dashes, and coastal stations could reply almost at once. But almost was still not enough to outrun tragedy. The night RMS Titanic struck an iceberg, April 14th, 1912, was a lesson in how delay and human trust and vision can prove fatal. Ice warnings had been sent by ships like the Californian and Masaba earlier that day. Wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride aboard Titanic received them but were overwhelmed with passenger messages and routine traffic. Even when the iceberg itself loomed ahead just before midnight, it was first a pale smudge on the horizon. Seen by lookout Frederick Fleet, too late for a turn of such a massive ship. The optical horizon fooled the eye. Water and air bent light in ways that made distance hard to judge, and the seconds between spotting and sounding the bell could not cancel the minutes. The danger had been building unseen. Seafer always lived with this uneasy relationship between signal and response. In the Second World War, convoy escorts in the North Atlantic scanned for U-boat periscopes breaking the surface. But the ocean's swell and the curvature of the earth meant those deadly shapes could already have fired before they were glimpsed. Radar improved reaction time but could not make it instant. Returns on the screen were echoes of waves bounced back, interpreted after a breath of time had passed. Even today, massive container ships use EYE's automatic identification system transponders to broadcast their position. But the data updates in intervals. The image on a captain's console is still slightly behind the living. See outside the window? For sailors of earlier centuries, the lag became almost a kind of weather itself, accepted and accounted for. Diaries from whalers sailing out of Nantucket or New Bedford in the 1830s talk of mastheads raised long before ship in view, an understanding that time bends at sea. Polynesian navigators crossing vast Pacific distances by reading swells. Stars in bird flight knew without formal theory that what they saw was an echo. A wave pattern hinted at an island that had already altered the ocean hours before the island itself appeared. The chant of a lookout might speak of canoes or sails still hidden by distance, but already present in consequence. Even for those on land, the horizon's delay shaped imagination. Families waiting in harbors for returning ships scanned for sails with telescopes and spyglasses, sometimes spotting loved ones hours before arrival. sometimes never seeing them at all, because storms or currents had changed what the eyes expected. Painters captured the moment when only a mast breaks the edge of the world. J.M.W. Turner's maritime canvases, for instance, show that half-formed silhouette of arrival or departure, a visual metaphor for news still on its way. To know all this is to see the sea differently. It teaches patience and humility, the understanding that sight is not truth but a story slightly late to arrive. You can watch a ship rise slowly into view and remember that its course and fate have already been decided somewhere beyond your reach. You can stand by a lighthouse and know that the light helps but cannot close the gap. Even now, with satellites feeding weather maps and radios chattering across frequencies, sailors talk of old minutes, those small stretches of time when what you know is just behind what is. The ocean, vast and quiet, keeps its secret until it chooses to send it back across the curved horizon. A delayed message wrapped in salt and light. There was a time when the idea of a message crossing an ocean in a single day belonged to dreamers in fiction, when letters moved with the slow rhythm of sails and steam, and every word had to endure salt, storms, and distance before it arrived. Then, in the summer of 1858, engineers led by Cyrus Westfield managed what many had believed impossible. They laid the first transatlantic telegraph cable between Valentia Island off the coast of Ireland and Heart's Content, a tiny fishing port in Newfoundland. It was a triumph that linked continents by copper and gutta percha insulation stretched along the seabed. But the speed was not what the Victorian public imagined. Each letter of a message crawled across the Atlantic at a pace measured in minutes, not seconds, the weak electrical signal needing amplification and careful decoding. Queen Victoria sent a congratulatory note to President James Buchanan on August 16th of that year. It took 16 hours for the complete text to pass under the sea, a marvel compared to weeks by ship, yet still a far cry from the instant pulse of a heartbeat. The ocean itself conspired against speed. Cold, crushing depths pressed on the cable, and imperfections in insulation bled power into the surrounding salt water. Operators at either end sat with delicate instruments called mirror galvanometers, their eyes fixed on tiny beams of light dancing across a scale as each electrical pulse struggled through. Every word had to be anticipated and guessed, a code built from dots and dashes where even a slight delay could blur meaning. When the first cable failed after just a few weeks, its insulation breached, its copper heart weakened by overvoltage, Field did not give up. Instead, he spent the next 8 years gathering new ships and better materials, until in July 1866 the Great Eastern, the largest ship then afloat, succeeded in laying a durable line from Ireland to Newfoundland. The journey of messages improved, but the sense of living slightly behind the event remained. Merchants could now know the price of cotton in Liverpool on the same day in New York, yet the numbers they saw already belonged to a transaction long since made. By the turn of the 20th century, a different kind of bridge appeared: radio. Guglielmo Marconi, the Italian engineer born in 1874, spent his youth tinkering with Hertz's experiments on electromagnetic waves, certain he could fling signals farther than anyone believed. In December 1901, he claimed to have received the faint, stuttering Morse letter S transmitted from Poldhu in Cornwall to an aerial strung between kites on Signal Hill, Newfoundland. The feat stunned newspapers. No wires at all. It's just invisible energy leaping 2,000 miles across the Atlantic. Yet early wireless was slow and fragile. Static from storms, drifting frequencies, and the Earth's ionosphere, bent and delayed signals. Ships at sea sent distress calls that might wander through interference for crucial seconds before a receiver caught them. Even when radio improved with vacuum tubes and tuned circuits, operators called sparks still had to decode bursts of sound, living slightly behind each new click. The First World War sharpened this awareness. In August 1914, the German cruiser SMS Emden sent frantic reports of British movements by wireless, but encryption and relay delays meant the intelligence often arrived too late to save her raiding mission from eventual destruction. The Zimmermann telegram, Germany's secret proposal to Mexico, intercepted in January 1917, crossed the Atlantic along multiple telegraph routes, and took days of decoding by Britons. Room 40 before its meaning reached Washington. Those days mattered. The message's revelation helped push the United States into war. But not before countless events had already shifted on the ground. In the Second World War, the pattern deepened. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park, working under Alan Turing and Dilly Knox, raced against the flow of German Enigma-ricted radio traffic. U-boat wolfpacks stalked convoys in the North Atlantic. Messages intercepted by listening posts in Wint, Scotland and Newfoundland were rushed to England by teleprinter and analyzed with bombs, electromechanical, machines that could try thousands of key settings. Yet hours or even a day might pass between a submarine's transmission and the Allies' ability to act. Convoy escorts often sailed into waters where the enemy had already moved. When the Great Battle for Atlantic supply lines peaked in 1943, these tiny delays cost ships and lives. Though without the code-breaking advantage, the losses would have been far worse, even for ordinary citizens. The feeling of trailing events became familiar. During the DHN invasion of June 6, 1944, families in New York or Toronto huddled around radios that stammered with updates hours after the landings began. By the time an announcer's voice declared troops were ashore at Omaha or Juno Beach, men had been fighting and dying there since dawn. Reporters filed dispatches by cable and wireless, but sensors and transmission limits meant the story the world heard was always a shadow of the real present. And yet, these imperfect bridges changed everything. Telegraph cables collapsed oceans from weeks to moments. Radio freed ships and armies from total isolation. Codebreakers turned even delayed knowledge into strategy. The knowledge that one could be nearly present, seconds or minutes behind rather than months, rewrote commerce, diplomacy, and war. Even the stock market began to move to this new pulse. By the late 19th century, traders in New York could react to London's closing prices before sunset thanks to transatlantic cables. And in 1927, Charles Lindbergh's solo flight was broadcast across continents in near real time. Though static and relays still made his arrival feel like something half-caught. Today, digital signals race under oceans in fiber optic strands. No thicker than a garden hose, and yet the same truth lingers. Information takes time, though now it's measured in milliseconds. Traders building microwave towers across the American Midwest to shave fractions of a second off futures data, or engineers launching Lorbit satellites to reduce latency, are still fighting the small lag that began with Field's first fragile copper line. The dream of perfect now remains out of reach. But each new wire and wave has drawn us closer, letting continents whisper to one another while the ocean still swallows. Just a sliver of time before giving the message back. If you sit in a darkened room and watch a film flicker to life on a screen, you feel as though the moment unfolding before you is happening right now. But what you are really seeing is a long string of still images captured in the past, and offered back at such a pace that the eye is tricked into believing it has never lost the present. Each frame is only a fraction of a second, 24 per second in most modern cinema. Yet your brain stitches them together so seamlessly that the cut between stillness and movement disappears. This deception, which we accept so readily, depends on the same quiet lag that lives everywhere in perception. By the time your eyes register a picture, it has already changed, and by the time your brain believes it sees flow, the images themselves have been gone for an instant. The idea that you could create motion by showing a series of still pictures was discovered long before anyone thought of full-length movies. In 1832, a Belgian physicist named Joseph Plateau built a spinning disc he called the phenakistoscope, with drawings arranged around its edge. When it turned and you looked through slits in the wheel, the pictures seemed to dance and leap. Later, toys like the zoetrope and the praxinoscope delighted Victorian parlors, showing horses galloping and faces laughing. All of these relied on what scientists then called persistence of vision, called the eye's tendency to hold an image for a fraction of a second after it is gone. That hold is what fills the gap and lets one picture slide into the next. It is not truly persistence in the retina, as once believed, but rather the brain's integration of light over short windows of time. When photography matured in the 19th century, Inventors saw that if a camera could take many pictures in quick succession, it might record motion itself. In 1878, Edward Muybridge, working for Leland Stanford in California, set up a row of cameras with tripwires to capture a horse in full stride. The resulting sequence, showing that at one point all 4 of the horse's hooves left the ground, was a scientific breakthrough, but also a hint that life could be recorded as a series of moments. Thomas Edison and his assistant William Kennedy Laurie Dixon took the next steps in the 1890s with the kinetograph camera and kinetoscope viewing machine. But their films were meant for one person at a time, peered at through a small pulley. It was the Lumiere brothers in France, Auguste and Louis, who transformed this curiosity into an event. On December 28, 1895, at the Salon Indien du Grand Café in Paris, they held what is now recognized as the first public film screening. The program included short scenes workers leaving a factory, a baby being fed, but the one that made the audience gasp and even flinch in their seats was El Arrivée d'une train en Gare de la Ciotat, a simple recording of a locomotive pulling into a station. People had seen trains before, but never one that seemed to move toward them inside a dark room. The brain, eager to believe the images were alive, leapt into panic for a split second before reason returned. Newspapers later said some viewers ducked or ran, though historians debate how dramatic the reaction truly was. Still, there was no denying the feeling of presence that moving pictures could summon. Even though every inch of film had been exposed, processed long before, the projectors of that era were marvels of careful timing. A light source, at first carbon arc lamps and later electric bulbs, shone through the strip of celluloid, while a mechanism known as a Maltese cross intermittently advanced the film one frame at a time and paused it in front of the lens. Between each pause, a rotating shutter blocked the light, hiding the jump so the eye would not see flicker. Early machines managed 16 frames per second. Later, the standard became 24 to reduce visible flutter. What audiences saw was never truly continuous. It was a rapid sequence of tiny pasts, smoothed into a convincing now by biology's slight delay. This deception deepened with sound. When synchronized talking pictures arrived in the late 1920s, The Jazz Singer, premiering on October 6, 1927, is usually named as the turning point. Engineers had to align audio, grooves or optical tracks with the image so that speech matched lips. Even when they succeeded, the voices were delayed by the length of time needed to record and reproduce. But because the lag was small and the brain eager to join sight with sound, it vanished for the viewer. Film editors learned to lean into this human tolerance, cutting shots on motion and reaction so that audiences felt present. Even though everything had been planned and stitched months earlier, through the 20th century, cinema built entire worlds on this temporal trick. Newsreels showed battles weeks after they ended, yet crowds watching in theaters felt they were standing on a beach in Normandy or seeing the Hindenburg burn in New Jersey. Documentaries and home movies let families visit Christmas mornings long past, turning memory into an illusion of current life. Even live broadcasts, when television came, kept a buffer seconds at first. Longer for technical reasons, so the now of sports or speeches was always a little late. The strange part is how willingly we accept this. We know, deep down, that every actor we watch is performing something long finished, that the street we see may not exist anymore, that even a documentary's truth is delayed, yet the emotion is immediate. Our eyes and ears, with their built-in lag, fill the gaps and let us sit in darkness believing we are there. When you next watch a film, you might think of the layers of past between you and what seems alive. Light captured months or decades ago. Sound recorded on old microphones. Frames racing from a projector or a digital file to your senses, your brain rushing to keep pace. The moving picture is one of humanity's great inventions, but also a gentle reminder of how perception works, not a window onto the present, but a fast-moving memory that feels alive because we are built to live just behind the moment. When Neil Armstrong stepped down the ladder of the lunar module on July 20th, 1969, and spoke the words that would become a marker in human memory. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind, millions of people watching television on. Earth heard him with a pause so brief it seemed like nothing at all. Yet that small pause contained the immense distance between worlds. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, but the moon is about 240,000 miles away. It takes a little over 1.25 seconds for a signal to make the journey in one direction, which means every conversation between Houston and the Sea of Tranquility already belonged to the immediate past by the time it reached the other end. When Armstrong spoke, the words left the gray dust beneath him, climbed through the black vacuum, bounced off relay antennas, and touched the giant dishes at Goldstone in California and Parks in Australia before being routed into television networks. By the time they arrived in living rooms across America and Europe, the moment on the moon had moved on. Inside NASA's Mission Control Center in Houston, this delay was not just an oddity. It was a reality every flight director and engineer had to live with. During Apollo 11, Gene Kranz and his team sat at consoles, headphones pressed tight, watching telemetry scroll across green monitors and lines of numbers and graphs. Each heartbeat of data, oxygen pressure, fuel levels, suit temperature, was a second old when it arrived. And the response they sent back to the astronauts took another second to return. In an emergency, those 2 seconds could stretch terrifyingly long. When Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were descending to land and their computer threw a 12:02 program alarm, controllers had to decide whether to abort or continue with only the information from a heartbeat ago. Steve Bales, the guidance officer, called go based on training and trust. Knowing the lunar module was already closer to the surface than the screen in front of him could prove, the same lag shaped every conversation. Astronauts on the moon sometimes spoke over each other because their voices crossed in mid-space, each unaware that the other had started to talk until a second later. Flight surgeons timing heart rates and breathing during spacewalks had to add those precious seconds before acting. Even something as simple as laughter felt stretched, one man on the moon chuckling. The response delayed and slightly offbeat when it came back from Earth. As exploration moved farther out, the gap widened until it became hours. The robotic probes that left Earth in the 1970s, Pioneer 10 and 11, Voyager 1 and 2, carried with them not only instruments and cameras, but also the understanding that contact would never be immediate again. When Voyager 2 flew past Neptune in August 1989, it was nearly 3 billion miles away. Each signal carrying its photographs and magnetic readings took more than 4 hours to reach the Deep Space Network's Great White Dish antennas in California. Engineers waiting for those images could do nothing but hold still and trust. Whatever had happened at the edge of the solar system had happened long before their screens flickered awake. Today, Voyager 1 is so far over 14 billion miles that a single word sent from Earth takes more than 22 hours to get there, and its whisper back arrives nearly a day after the command was made. These delays are not just numbers. They shape how missions are run and how decisions feel. When the Mars rover's Spirit and Opportunity bounced to the surface in January 2004, controllers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory could not steer them live. At the speed of light, a radio wave to Mars can take between 4 and 24 minutes, depending on the planet's positions. Driving a rover there is like playing chess through the mail. You plan a sequence of moves, send them, and only much later find out if the machine obeyed or if it is stuck in sand. The celebrated 7 minutes of terror during Curiosity's 2012 landing refers to the entry and descent that mission teams must watch without influence. By the time signals arrive saying the spacecraft has touched down, it has already been safe or destroyed for many minutes. Even with all this, the human urge to speak across space has not faltered. The Apollo astronauts learned to live with the delay as though it were a natural current. Roger Houston came a beat after each report, patient and calm. Voyager's engineers, long retired, still gather updates knowing the probe's messages left before yesterday's sunrise. New Horizons sent its historic pictures of Pluto's heart-shaped plane back in July 2015. And each packet took 4.5 hours to make the trip. When the first images arrived in Maryland and cheered a crowded control room, the spacecraft itself was already millions of miles farther on its way, this constant trailing behind events in space. Flight is both humbling and strangely comforting. It teaches those who venture beyond Earth to trust in planning, to act with foresight, and to accept that knowledge will always arrive just after the moment it could change. It also brings a quiet sense of wonder to anyone who listens to recordings of Space 2 ground chatter, the clipped calcenes, the pauses built into each reply, the invisible line where present turns into past, and then back into present again in someone else's ear, perhaps. What's most moving is the thought that every photograph of another world is an invitation from time itself. The pale blue dot image of Earth taken by Voyager 1 in February 1990 was more than 4 hours old when it reached us, yet we looked at it and felt seen. The Apollo footage that still loops through documentaries is not live memory, but memory delayed and preserved. The moon's dust long settled while we continue to hear its first words. Space makes the human sense of now stretch and bend, reminding us that distance is not just miles, but seconds and hours. And yet somehow we keep reaching across it, patient, trusting that even a delayed voice is worth hearing. Step outside on a morning when the air smells like rain, and look at the wide sweep of clouds rolling across the horizon. What you see is not the sky as it is, but the sky as it was. Every photograph taken by the satellites that orbit our planet, the GOES series above the Americas, the Japanese Himawari over the Pacific, Europe's Meteosat is already a few minutes old when it reaches the weather maps we check on phones or televisions. It takes time for the satellite to scan the planet's curve, convert light and heat into digital signals, beam them back to Earth, and for ground stations to process those signals into the swirling, colored shapes we know. By the time a meteorologist points at a radar loop and says, "Here's where the storm is right now," the mass of air and moisture has already moved, even if only slightly. The images we trust for safety are, in their essence, history. This was always true, though we once had no satellites to prove it. Before modern forecasting, sailors and farmers read the sky directly, leaning on signs and instruments that could not predict so much as give warning just after change had begun. A falling barometer, invented in the 1600s by Evangelista Torricelli, signaled dropping air pressure and often meant weather turning rough. But the needle dipped only after the larger pattern was already underway. By the 18th century, sea captains in the Royal Navy carried aneroid barometers and observed the direction of the wind, the shape of clouds, and even the way swells rolled under their hulls. James Cook's journals mention long, slow readings, captain noting a sudden drop before storms in the South Pacific, but always reacting to what had already started far beyond sight. On land, farmers across Europe and North America used sayings like "red sky at night, sailors delight," "red sky in morning, sailors take warning," a folk recognition of light refracted through dust and moisture that trailed the true front of a weather system by ours. When telegraphy came in the 19th century, it changed forecasting because for the first time, information about distant storms could outrun the storms themselves. Barely. The British Meteorological Office under Admiral Robert Fitzroy began issuing storm warnings for ports in the 1860s using telegrams from far-flung observers. Yet messages might take hours to compile and send. Ships leaving Liverpool or Boston still sailed into conditions that had shifted since the last report. In October 1881, the Eyemouth disaster off Scotland took 189 fishermen's lives, despite barometers falling. Warnings reached the coast, but too late. As the storm was already ashore, modern meteorology learned to think in this lagged way. When meteorologist Wilhelm Bjerkens and his colleagues in Norway around 1918 began describing warm and cold fronts as moving, evolving boundaries, they knew their charts were not of the present, but of what had just happened. Data from scattered weather stations arrived by telegraph or radio, drawn into synoptic maps that were at best hours behind real skies. Forecasts were always extrapolations forward from a frozen, outdated picture. Satellites in the latter half of the 20th century gave us something closer to immediacy, but never perfect. TIROS-1, the first successful weather satellite launched in 1960, sent back grainy, black-and-white images of cloud tops that were sometimes a full orbit old by the time they were printed out. Today's GOES-16 and GOES-17 produce sharp color composites every 5 minutes for the continental United States, but that still means anyone watching a looping animation is looking at what the storm did several minutes ago, not what it does now. Radar 2 has delays. Doppler radars send pulses of energy and wait for returns, scanning slice by slice through the atmosphere. A completed volume scan can take 4 to 6 minutes. So that brilliant hook echo of a forming tornado is a few minutes behind the actual rotation above the field or town it threatens. Hurricanes show this paradox most dramatically. When meteorologists tracked Hurricane Katrina in August 2005, aircraft called hurricane hunters flew through the storm, dropping instruments called sondes that radioed back temperature, pressure, and wind speed. Yet even those readings were snapshots. By the time the data reached the National Hurricane Center in Miami and became part of the next public advisory, the storm had already changed shape. Katrina's infamous turn toward New Orleans late on August 28th unfolded faster than the updates that tried to catch it. Forecast cones, those familiar white paths on TV, are built on models fed by old information. Each new cone is a guess based on where the storm was, not where it is. Still, the chase has improved. Geostationary satellites now send nearly real-time lightning maps. Polar orbiters sweep the globe every 90 minutes, feeding supercomputers that run fluid dynamics equations to predict motion beyond the old snapshots. Yet the forecasts remain a pursuit of a moving target. Hurricane Ian, in September 2022, shifted slightly just before landfall on Florida's Gulf Coast. Warnings saved many, but could not erase the fundamental truth that the eye outran our gaze. There is something humbling about living with this delay. People still step onto porches to smell the air and test the wind, because in a way we are doing what our ancestors did. Looking back, even as we try to look forward, farmers scan the sky, though satellites hover overhead. Pilots of small planes still trust a quick glance at cumulus towers building near the horizon, knowing the official report on their radios is minutes behind. Weather apps refresh constantly, but cannot defeat the fact that nature moves while data travels. Yet this chase, though never perfect, has saved lives beyond measure. When the Galveston hurricane of 1900 killed thousands, warnings were faint and late. Today, even with lag, millions evacuate ahead of similar storms because hours of notice exist where none once did. Each new satellite and radar sweep trims the gap, though never fully erases it, teaching a kind of patience and caution. The sky we look at is always older than we think, but knowing that has made us better at living under it. Planning not for what we see, but for what we know is already on its way. On battlefields, time bends in ways that decide everything, and it has always done so. In the summer of 1863, Union and Confederate armies moved across Pennsylvania toward what would become the Battle of Gettysburg. Generals tried to pull the newest tool of war, the electric telegraph, into their hands like a weapon. But the wires carried both promise and peril, because the messages they delivered were already a breath behind the events they described. Abraham Lincoln himself spent long nights in the telegraph room of the War Department in Washington, waiting for updates that left the front hours earlier. A dispatch might announce that General George Meade's forces were holding a line, but by the time the paper reached the president's desk and he unfolded it, the smoke on that ridge had drifted on, and men had moved or died. Field operators sent dots and dashes through fragile copper lines strung hastily along fences and across rivers. But storms, sabotage, or simple distance slowed everything. Even a single cut wire meant hours lost while riders carried handwritten notes to the next intact station. At Antietam, 2 years earlier, orders from headquarters lagged behind shifting skirmishes, and brigades often acted blind, because the picture painted by their leaders belonged to the morning rather than the current. Afternoon, that gap between what is known and what is happening, haunted armies long after the Civil War ended. During the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces prepared to cross the English Channel, the very act of waiting for the right weather was a race with time that could never be won outright. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower depended on reports from meteorologists scattered across Britain, using ships, balloons, and coastal stations to measure pressure and cloud movement. But the information came in pieces, and with hours of delay. Forecast charts drawn late on June 4th and June 5th suggested a narrow window when winds and waves might ease enough for the landing craft to survive. But those charts were made from data gathered well before. James Stagg, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, worked with imperfect aging information, plotting fronts that had already shifted over the North Atlantic. The fateful decision to launch on the morning of June 6th was essentially a bet made on whether that had moved since the last readings. Soldiers boarding ships at Portsmouth or Weymouth stepped into the night not with a real-time map, but with a story of skies past, in the hope that it would still hold when dawn came. Even once troops were ashore, that delay remained. Naval gunfire support relied on spotters and aircraft whose radioed corrections took time to travel and be acted upon. Shells landed where the enemy had been minutes earlier. Paratroopers dropped into Normandy fields on winds, predicted hours before and scattered beyond planned zones, because the atmosphere had changed faster than the forecasts could. Each decision at headquarters in England reached the beaches and hedgerows behind the reality it meant to shape. Today, with satellites and high-speed networks, you might think war has outrun such lags. But even the most modern tools cannot close the gap entirely. Drone operators guiding unmanned aircraft over Afghanistan or Ukraine watch video feeds that feel immediate but are not. Every image is the result of light captured by a camera, converted to digital signals, bounced to satellites or relay stations, compressed, sent across oceans of fiber and air, decompressed, and displayed. The total delay might be less than 2 seconds. But in combat, that is enough for a person to move behind cover or a vehicle to change direction. Pilots know this and aim slightly ahead, predicting where the target will be when the missile round arrives. Commanders watching live feeds from distant bunkers see a moment already gone. When they issue an order, travels into a near future that is only guessed at. The rhythm of these battlefield seconds shapes strategy and psychology. During the Persian Gulf War in 1991, reporters spoke of real-time war as CNN broadcast images almost instantly from Baghdad. Yet the Pentagon quietly reminded commanders that the live footage was delayed by satellite hops, sometimes several seconds or more, enough to keep sensitive locations safe, but also proof that the picture was never truly current. In more recent conflicts, network latency and encryption delays still mean that drone pilots in Nevada watch what happened to blink earlier over Raqqa or Helmand. Algorithms attempt to predict movement and adjust aim. But prediction is never the same as presence. It is sobering to think that the more sophisticated our communication becomes, the more conscious we are of this unavoidable lag. In the Civil War, men simply trusted that the courier's paper was fresh enough. By D-Day, meteorologists whispered about how stale their Atlantic charts were, even as Eisenhower made the call. Now, digital clocks mark the delay in milliseconds on control screens. Cold and precise, but no less real. And yet soldiers, sailors, and pilots adapt. They learn to think just ahead of the picture, to anticipate rather than react, to work inside what John Boyd later called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act faster than the other side can. That loop itself exists because observation is slow. To win is to shorten the gap between knowing and doing, even if it can never vanish. There is a quiet weight in realizing that no commander, no matter how brilliant, has ever fought in true real time. All have stood a few seconds behind their own war, making choices that reach forward from shadows of the past. And somewhere, whether in the hush of a 19th century telegraph office, the tense air of Eisenhower's map room, or the dim glow of a drone control station, someone is always waiting for a signal to finish its journey. Hoping the world ahead has not changed too much in the meantime, walk into an old clock shop and listen for a while. And you will hear a room alive with tiny delays. Each instrument on the walls and shelves a long case clock with a polished brass pendulum. A ship's chronometer, sealed against salt air. A silver pocket watch that once rode in a waistcoat marks time by waiting, letting energy escape in measured steps rather than in one unstoppable rush. That is the heart of mechanical time, not a smooth flow, but a system built on controlled pause. In a pendulum clock first perfected by Christian Huygens in 1656, a swinging weight regulates the release of gears through an escapement. a clever device that allows the wheels to move forward one tooth at a time, catching and holding before letting go. Every swing has its own lag, about 1 second for a long household pendulum, slightly faster or slower depending on length and temperature. The clock's tick is not the present happening now, but the echo of energy spent and measured out a beat behind. Even smaller clocks, like those prized in the 18th century by explorers such as John Harrison, rely on similar mechanics. Harrison's marine chronometers, which made precise navigation possible by keeping near-perfect time at sea, used pairs of balances and springs that beat back and forth, these tiny oscillations smoothed into something trustworthy enough for sailors to find longitude. But every reading was still the record of an event that had just happened. The second hand you watch sweep across a dial shows where the mechanism was a moment ago. You are forever glimpsing the past, even when you believe you are looking at now. By the late 1800s, when trains began binding continents together with speed unknown in earlier centuries, the human cost of scattered, local timekeeping became suddenly and brutally clear. Towns once set their clocks by the sun. Noon arrived when the church tower's shadow reached a certain point, but with locomotives racing from city to city, every village having its own minute made disaster almost certain. On August 12, 1853, 2 trains collided head-on near Valley Falls, Rhode Island, killing 14 and injuring dozens, partly because crews followed mismatched local times. In 1857, another crash near New Hamburg, New York, left 28 dead when engineers failed to align watches set to different towns' hours. The railroads responded by demanding standard time across their networks. By November 18, 1883, the major American lines adopted 4 time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific, agreeing that noon would no longer be when the local sun said so, but when a shared clock decreed. Church bells rang that day, but also protests rose. Some townsfolk hated surrendering their natural noon to something drawn on maps. Governments caught up slowly. It wasn't until March 19, 1918, that the United States Congress formally established the standard time zones and daylight saving rules. Britain had moved earlier. Greenwich Mean Time had been defined in 1884 as the world's prime meridian. But even their standard time met resistance before rail schedules and telegraph lines forced it through. Everywhere now became a human construction designed to reduce chaos. Yet it remained approximate, a compromise between solar truth and mechanical convenience. As technology improved, clocks sought to shed some of their own built-in delay, but never fully succeeded. The quartz watch, first commercialized in the 1920s and booming in the 1970s with brands like Seiko, uses the vibration of a thin quartz crystal under electric current to mark time with incredible steadiness. The oscillations are so fast, 32,000 per second, that the delay between cause and effect shrinks beyond what the eye can follow, yet it is still there. Circuits count pulses, waiting for enough to register a second before moving the hands or changing the digital display. Even the atomic clocks that underpin GPS and internet timekeeping measure the microwave ticks of cesium atoms flipping energy states. Their precision is breathtaking, but each tick is an event already past when it is reported. Ironically, the closer we try to get to perfect simultaneity, the more we discover how impossible it is. The railroad solved its deadly mismatches by standardizing time. But in doing so, it revealed that present is a social agreement. Towns and nations simply decided to believe in the same second, even while knowing it was chosen, not found. Today, your smartphone syncs to coordinated universal time UTC, calculated from atomic clocks, spread across continents, and adjusted with leap seconds. Because the Earth itself refuses to spin predictably. You glance at the glowing digits and trust them, but they are the result of signals delayed through cables and satellites. Corrections layered on top of corrections, until the number in your hand is as much consensus as it is reality. Think of how this plays out in daily life. A New York stock trader reacts to a price displayed on a screen. That price was transmitted from an exchange microseconds ago, but in that microsecond, fortunes can shift. Pilots rely on coordinated clocks to separate their aircraft in the sky. But the GPS signals feeding those clocks left satellites milliseconds earlier, enough to require constant adjustment. Even the great countdowns of spaceflight, T-10, 9, 8 are not truly live. Each step ripples through cables, speakers, human reaction before the rockets move. The history of time is, in some sense, a long attempt to deny delay while quietly depending on it. Pendulums and escapements built stability out of waiting. Railroads built safety out of shared seconds, even if they were invented seconds. Quartz and cesium reduced drift but could not erase the gap between event and awareness. What we call now is a finely tuned fiction, communal decision to trust that a recent past is close enough to guide us. Yet there is comfort in that. The same human impulse that strung telegraph wires along train tracks in mapped time zones also built communities and safety. Knowing that your watch and the clock on the station wall agree, even if they are both trailing the sun by a breath, lets you move with others. The tick behind the tick becomes part of our shared rhythm, a quiet acknowledgement that we are never truly caught up, but close enough to live and work and meet each other at what we call the present. Sit still for a moment and lift one of your hands just enough to let the fingers hover above your knee. You might think the movement begins when you feel yourself choose to do it, but the choice you are aware of is already late. Deep in the folds of your brain, far below the hum of conscious thought, preparations started before you felt anything. Neurons in the motor cortex fired, sending signals down the spinal cord and into the muscles of your shoulder and arm. And only after that activity had built momentum did the quiet sense of deciding catch up. This is one of the strange truths of being human, to live as if you are in the present. Your mind must constantly run ahead, guessing what is about to happen. While the part of you that feels like I comes slightly afterward, scientists have chased this mystery for decades. In the early 1980s, Benjamin Libet, a researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, designed a now famous experiment that asked volunteers to make a simple flick of the wrist whenever they felt the urge. Each person watched a special clock with a bright dot spinning on its face, and was asked to note where the dot was when they first felt the intention to move. At the same time, electrodes measured brain activity on their scalps. What Libet found startled almost everyone who studied free will. A clear signal called the readiness potential appeared in the motor areas of the brain about 350 milliseconds before the volunteers reported deciding to act. In other words, the brain seemed to start preparing the movement before the conscious mind said, now. Other researchers repeated and refined the experiment. Some, like Patrick Haggard and John Dylan Haynes, used more advanced imaging to see that decisions could sometimes be predicted seconds before people became aware of making them. These studies do not mean that choice is an illusion, but they do show how far behind conscious awareness really is. Our sense of a crisp, immediate now is something the brain builds after the fact. Like a narrator joining a scene that started without it, this predictive way of living is essential for survival, because it takes time for nerves to deliver raw data, light hitting the retina, sound pushing at the eardrum, touch traveling from skin to spinal cord. The brain cannot simply wait for perfect input. It would always be reacting too late. Instead, it constructs models of what is likely to happen next and uses them to get a head start. When you catch a ball, you are not following where it is, but where it will be. Your visual system estimates its arc and speed and sends commands in advance. When you reach for a cup, your hand starts to shape itself before you feel the cup's rim. This is sometimes called predictive coding or forward modeling. The brain is a guesser, constantly forecasting and then updating when reality arrives. Daily life is full of examples so ordinary we hardly notice. You walk across a busy street trusting that the cars you saw a moment ago will continue moving at the same pace. If one stops suddenly, you are surprised because your brain had already predicted its forward motion. You speak and pause because you can almost hear the shape of your next sentence before it leaves your mouth. A pianist playing Chopin on a grand stage does not think about each key as it comes. The brain's motor maps have laid out a second or two of music ahead, ready to adjust if a note goes wrong, but otherwise trusting the path. Even something as small as turning your head before a sound fully Registers shows the brain's guesswork. The muscles move toward where the source probably is before the auditory system finishes its processing the cost of this prediction. Is that the conscious feeling of I chose and I reacted is out of sync? Many people have had the unsettling experience of braking a car before realizing why. The foot moved because the brain saw danger before the thinking mind caught up. Athletes call it being in the zone, where actions feel effortless and immediate, because prediction has taken over. Gamers and fighter pilots rely on the same loop, perception trailing slightly, action already underway. Sometimes the lag shows in small illusions. If you tap a table and then hear a delayed sound of your own tap played back to you, your brain quickly rewrites the sense of when you acted, pulling your decision forward or back to fit the sound. Magicians use this distracting attention and then creating a false sense of timing, so you believe a coin vanished at the moment you willed it. Though the trick was finished earlier, even the feel of ownership over your body is tuned by prediction. Experiments with fake hands show that if visual cues line up just enough, the brain adopts the dummy as its own because it expects certain sensations to follow. Libet himself was careful not to claim that free will disappears under his electrodes. He spoke instead of a veto power, that while initiation may begin unconsciously, the conscious self can stop an act in the final instant before it completes. Yet the research leaves a quiet humility. What you feel as a present tense decision is often a postscript added by the narrator of the mind. Knowing this does not make life colder. It explains how we move through a world that would otherwise be impossibly fast. Without these guesses, you could not speak fluidly, catch yourself when you stumble, or navigate a conversation. Your mind, like a skilled editor, gives you the experience of living right on the edge of the moment, even while it smooths and delays. The thought can be unsettling at first. Yet there is also wonder in it. You are carried forward by a brain working ahead to protect and guide you, giving you the gift of presence, even though presence itself is stitched together from pieces of the near past and the near future. The slow lightning of thought flashes long before you name it. But the story you tell, I reached, I spoke, I decided, is what makes life coherent. To understand this is to glimpse how deep the river runs beneath awareness, and how gracefully it lets you float, believing you live in the now, when in truth, you ride a current always, slightly ahead and slightly behind. There are places on earth where time itself seems to slow and bend until the idea of a present moment begins to blur. And nowhere is that truer than in the far north during the long polar night. In winter, the Arctic falls under a darkness that can last for weeks or months. A twilight so stretched and uncertain that explorers once wrote of feeling unmoored, as though the clocks they carried had slipped out of step with the living world. When Sir John Franklin sailed from England in May of 1845, aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror in search of the fabled Northwest Passage, he and his men brought the best navigation instruments Victorian science could offer. Marine chronometers carefully wound and compared, sextants polished for starlight readings, barometers and thermometers sealed against the cold. Yet as the sun vanished below the horizon for good in late autumn and the ice locked the ships fast, those fine tools seemed less immediate than the shifting dark. A star sight taken at noon might be reduced to guesswork by the time its data was plotted, because the very ice around the ships drifted miles each day under the pressure of unseen currents, so that their calculated position was always a delayed echo of where they had been. Franklin's expedition never returned. It would be decades before fragments of truth reached home. A note found at Victory Point on King William Island, 1859, by a search party led by Francis Leopold McClintock, telling of deaths and desertions from the trapped crews. A document written months before the men abandoned the ships and headed south on foot. By the time the message was read in London, its authors were long gone. Proof of how impossible it was to know the now of the polar world. Later explorers learned similar lessons, even with better tools. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian who had become the first to reach the South Pole in December 1911, honed his polar craft in the Arctic. In 1903, he took the small ship GA through the Northwest Passage, and though he succeeded, he learned how treacherous delayed knowledge could be. Amundsen's chronometers drifted slightly, as all clocks do. and every time he adjusted them by celestial sights, the ice had already moved his camp. Weather, too, was a lagging signal. A wind change felt in the moment might have begun its journey across the polar seas days before. Storm fronts crept without warning because the usual cloud signs were hidden or distorted by cold and perpetual night. To survive, Amundsen came to trust not just instruments but a deep intuition, a willingness to act ahead of certainty, because certainty was always late. There is also the haunting light of the aurora borealis, which adds another layer to the sense of delay. Those shimmering curtains of green and violet that dance across the Arctic sky are the product of solar storms. Its birth lies far away and days in the past. Particles ejected from the sun travel millions of miles before colliding with Earth's magnetic field, funneling toward the poles and setting the upper atmosphere aglow. When a lonely watchman on the ice in January stares upward at a sudden wave of color, he is witnessing an event that began long before he felt its wonder. Franklin's men, and later explorers wintering at places like Joahaven or Framheim, saw these lights and sometimes read them as omens, not knowing that what they watched was the sun's breath arriving long after it left. The deeper challenge came from isolation itself. Without a normal cycle of sunrise and sunset, the human sense of time falters. In diaries kept by polar parties, the American Charles Francis Hall in the 1870s, Fridtjof Nansen aboard the Fram in the 1890s, one hears of men sleeping odd hours, waking unsure if it is day or night and arguing over whether it is Monday or Thursday. Some grew despondent because events felt unmoored, everything delayed or anticipatory, but never present. Nansen wrote in February 1894, "Deep in the drifting ice north of Siberia, that time loses its meaning. We live on memory and forecast in such conditions. The brain seems to stretch to fill the dark. Leaning heavily on recollection and prediction since fresh sensory anchors are few, even with modern expeditions, this distortion persists. Scientists wintering at research stations like Svalbard or Antarctica's McMurdo describe how video calls home are always behind the lived moment, slowed by satellite relays and scheduling, so that their connection to loved ones is layered with both physical and temporal distance. Weather updates, though instant compared to Franklin's world, still arrive minutes or hours behind reality. GPS positions and shifting sea ice remain snapshots, not guarantees. A camp can drift unseen, making last night's coordinates slightly wrong by morning, and yet there is resilience in those who endure such delay. Amundsen thrived because he learned to think forward, to move before proof came. Modern polar travelers speak of a gut clock, a deep, almost unconscious rhythm built from countless small cues. The feel of wind on the face, the way frost patterns shift on a tent, the sound of distant ice pressure. This inner sense tries to replace the missing now, giving action a thread to hold when all instruments trail behind. Perhaps that is the secret the polar night teaches. That the present is a fragile construction, easier to lose than we admit, but also something we can rebuild out of patience and attention. Standing on ice older than history, watching aurora from storms long past, steering by stars whose light left before your grandparents were born, you understand that to live is to navigate with echoes and forecasts, not with certainty. The now you inhabit is stitched from the near past and the imagined near future, and though it wavers, it is enough to keep moving across the dark. If you have ever stood on a pier and listened for a returning echo after tossing a stone into deep water, you know how strangely slow the sea can be to answer? That delay grows vast and consequential. Once you leave the surface and attempt to map or travel through the enormous black spaces below, in water, sound travels faster than in air, about 1,500 meters per second. Yet the distances involved and the complexity of underwater acoustics turn even that speed into a kind of long, uncertain conversation. The ocean bends and scatters every signal. Layers of warm and cold water act like glass, bending sound into unpredictable paths. And so, the return that finally reaches a waiting ear or instrument is often older than you want it to be. For those who first tried to measure the deep, this was a constant frustration. In the early 20th century, navies began experimenting with sonar, sound, navigation, and ranging to locate icebergs and submarines after tragedies like the sinking of RMS Titanic in April 1912. Titanic had gone down in just over 2 hours after striking an iceberg, and in the years following, shipping companies and naval engineers tried to invent ways to see with sound. A ship would send out a ping, a brief, an energy pulse, and then wait for the echo to return from the seafloor, or any obstacle. On paper, the idea seemed immediate. In practice, every echo arrived late and distorted. An officer listening with headphones or watching a stylus trace on smoked glass would hear C's answer seconds after the question was asked. Enough time for a submarine to have changed position or an iceberg to have shifted with the swell. During the First World War, British and American destroyers hunted German U-boats with hydrophones and primitive sonar sets. But by the time an operator plotted a contact, the enemy was often somewhere else entirely. The limits of speed haunt even our greatest underwater searches. When Robert Ballard and his team finally found the Titanic's wreck in September 1985, they used side-scan sonar dragged miles behind a research vessel, painting the seafloor with acoustic pulses. Each ping had to travel down more than 12,000 feet, bounce off debris, and then climb back up. What Ballard saw on his monitors was always a moment behind the towed sensor's actual passage. The ship itself moved on, and operators pieced together maps from delayed shadows. The discovery of ghostly images of boilers and hull plates was triumph built on patience with lagging truth. Decades later, even with multi-beam sonar and remotely operated vehicles, oceanographers still talk about how their maps are reconstructions made from echoes long gone by the time they appear on a screen. For submariners, the stakes are higher. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet boats prowled the deep in silence, listening for one another. They knew that sound is the only reliable long-range signal underwater, but they also knew it plays tricks with time. The famous Sword Channel, a layer of water where sound can travel thousands of miles, lets navies hear distant events but always after a pause. When the USS Thresher was lost off Cape Cod in April 1963, rescuers pieced together acoustic data from hydrophone networks. The implosion had been heard, but interpreting when and where took long minutes and uncertain mathematics. In an emergency, that delay can mean everything, because a damaged submarine descending out of control may pass the point of rescue before surface crews even know where it was, even in peaceful exploration. The ocean slows our attempts to be present. Remotely operated vehicles like the French Nautil or the American Deep discover or send video back to research ships in something close to real time. But the chain is long. Light from the seabed hits a camera sensor, becomes electrical signal, travels up fiber optic tether or through acoustic modems, passes through computers that compress and transmit, and only then arrives on deck. The images of strange fish and hydrothermal vents appear on monitors seconds after the vehicle glides past them. The crews who cheered when the black smokers of the Galapagos Rift were first filmed in 1977 were seeing something slightly behind the vehicle's own view. This sense of lag grows extreme at the deepest point known on Earth, the Challenger deep in the Mariana Trench. When filmmaker James Cameron piloted his deep-sea Challenger submersible there in March 2012, nearly 7 miles down, every bit of communication with the surface had to fight through crushing water. Acoustic signals carrying depth and status crawled upward and returned with delay. The surface team always knew his situation seconds late. In modern unmanned dives, such as those run by Japan's Kaiko or the American Victor Vesovo in 2019, control and telemetry are likewise a slow dance. The live feeds shown during those missions, ghostly seabed, pale amphipods scuttling, are not truly live, but buffered and transmitted after processing. To watch them is to look slightly backward in time. Ocean science has learned to live with this. Bathymetric charts used by ships are mosaics of delayed returns. Each line and contour is something the sea revealed reluctantly, ping by ping. The deep ocean floor remained mostly unmapped until well into the 21st century. Not only because of remoteness, but because of this slow reporting. A single research cruise might gather weeks of echoes and still no less than it seemed. The true present of the seafloor always a step beyond. Even today, projects like Seabed 2030 aim to map the entire ocean, but must accept that every dataset is historic by the time it's drawn. There's a certain humility that comes with this understanding. Standing on a deck while instruments hum and screens glow, scientists and sailors know they are chasing a past that keeps slipping away. The sea gives back its answers reluctantly and late, yet those answers are enough to navigate, to discover, to remember. A sonar ping leaves the hull, disappears into darkness, and returns changed slower than you wish, but full of truth. In that pause between question and echo, the ocean reminds us that presence is never instant, and that some of the most important knowledge we have about the world arrives just after the moment it could have been immediate in the middle of the 20th century. As nuclear weapons came to define the boundaries of survival, the quiet distance between an event and our awareness of it became frighteningly important. Deep inside the Pentagon in Washington and the Kremlin in Moscow, war rooms filled with clocks, screens, telephones tried to force the future to stand still long enough for decisions to catch up. Yet even with the fastest electronics available, seconds of delay remained. And those seconds could mean the difference between life and the destruction of cities. At the height of the Cold War in the early 1960s, when the United States and the Soviet Union built vast constellations of radars and satellites to watch one another, the men and women who served in those rooms understood that what they saw was already slightly old. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, better known as NOR, built its famous Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado to filter thousands of radar returns in real time. But real time in that context still meant seconds of travel for signals bouncing from distant installations. A missile launched from a Soviet submarine or a silo in Siberia would take about 30 minutes to reach North America. But the detection of its fiery birth was not instant. Early warning radars at Thule in Greenland or Filing Dales in Yorkshire would spot a plume. Then computers would process and relay the finding through layers of verification before it appeared as a red track on a screen. Those extra seconds and minutes of communication and confirmation might seem tiny, but they were enough to haunt military planners. Because a president or general had only a brief window to decide whether to answer fire with fire to shrink those delays. Both sides built even more complex networks. The United States launched satellites under the Defense Support Program beginning in 1972. Look for the infrared signature of rocket launches. The Soviets created OCO satellites to do the same, but neither network could deliver knowledge faster than light itself. There was still time for sensors to gather data, for ground stations to decode signals, for human operators to cross-check and alert commanders. Messages sped along red telephones. And secure lines, the famous hotline between Washington and Moscow installed after the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was meant to prevent misunderstandings, yet even that line, first a teletype circuit and later upgraded to satellite voice, was not instant in the way ordinary conversation is. Encoding, transmission, and translation built small but unavoidable pauses into every exchange. When John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev faced one another across the brink during those 13 October days, each note sent over the Atlantic took long, tense minutes to arrive and be understood. While ships moved and missiles were readied faster than the words could travel, the nightmare of delay showed itself most clearly in false alarms. On September 26, 1983, at a Soviet early warning center south of Moscow, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty when alarms suddenly blared and his monitors announced that a U.S. missile had been launched, soon joined by what appeared to be 4 more. The OCO satellite system had misread sunlight reflecting off high clouds as rocket plumes. According to procedure, Petrov should have reported the attack upward, beginning a chain that could lead to a retaliatory launch, yet he paused. He knew the system was new and might err, and he reasoned that a real American strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not just a handful. He chose to mark the alert as false and wait. Minutes passed in silence. No radar corroboration arrived, and the threat faded. Petrov's moment of hesitation, that deliberate acceptance of a few seconds. Delayed to let truth catch up, likely saved millions of lives. The United States faced its own close calls. In November 1979, a training tape simulating a massive Soviet attack was accidentally loaded into the NORAD computers, sending warning to command posts and even scrambling bomber crews to their aircraft before someone realized nothing was happening outside. In January 1995, Russian radars mistook a Norwegian scientific rocket for a possible submarine launch, prompting President Boris Yeltsin to activate his nuclear briefcase. Each time, layers of communication slowed the rush to catastrophe. Just long enough for humans to intervene, these near disasters reveal how fragile the idea of now is when the world's fate can depend on it. Leaders have always wanted perfect information. The nuclear age demanded it and discovered it cannot exist. Every picture on a radar console is a few heartbeats behind. Every missile track is a story already begun. Presidents and generals must decide on futures with shadows for evidence. Yet delay, as dangerous as it seems, also offers a hidden mercy. It is the small pause that allows reflection, the extra breath that lets someone like Petrov ask if the computer could be wrong. Military planners came to value deliberate friction, confirmation protocols, redundant sensors, phone calls that force a voice to meet a voice before launch orders move. The hotline, for all its mythic name, was never truly hot. It was slow enough to type, to translate, to consider. That slowness may have saved the world more than once. Even today, when detection systems are faster and artificial intelligence sifts data in milliseconds, the fundamental truth remains. Warning is never perfectly present. By the time an alert reaches a decision maker, it is already a small artifact of the past. Some engineers argue that this is a feature, not a flaw, a space for second thoughts built into machinery that could otherwise race to annihilation. To look back at those tense decades is to see human beings trying to master time itself and discovering its resistance. We built networks to collapse oceans and continents into seconds and still could not make the present arrive on demand. And perhaps that is what saved us, the knowledge that now cannot be forced. That even at the edge of catastrophe, there is a breath of delay where reason might still live. If you imagine the very first humans stepping out onto an open plain, listening for movement in the grass, you begin to understand why the brain learned to live just behind the moment. The nervous system, from its earliest forms, had to solve an impossible problem. The world moves faster than raw sensation can travel. Light, sound, and touch take time to become electrical pulses and climb into awareness, yet survival depends on quick response. Evolution's answer was not to eliminate delay that is impossible, but to build a sort of buffer, a half-beat of time that allows the brain to collect many signals, smooth them into a picture, and predict forward just enough to act. In this way, we live slightly behind but rarely feel lost. This tiny margin is most obvious when something threatens us. If you step off a curb and hear the sudden roar of an engine, you leap back before you can name what's happening. In that moment, the sound waves have already struck the eardrum and traveled up the auditory nerve. But the conscious thought, car or danger, is slower than the reflex circuits running through the brainstem and spinal cord. Those circuits begin to contract muscles in less than half a second, buying safety before explanation arrives. Researchers studying defensive responses call this the half-second delay, a built-in window where unconscious processing outruns the story we later tell ourselves. You might say the body begins to escape first and only afterward informs the mind why. This buffering has deep roots in our species. Consider how early hunters and gatherers needed to integrate many types of input. The flick of a predator's tail in the grass, the change of wind carrying scent, the shift in birdsong, none of which by itself meant danger, but together painted a picture. Acting on one clue alone might waste energy or cause false alarm, but waiting too long could mean death. So the brain evolved to gather and weigh signals just long enough to improve the odds, then to predict what would happen next. That slight delay is why we can run, throw, or dodge with accuracy beyond what a simple reflex would allow. Over time, humans discovered that the same buffering that protects in danger also builds the mental space we call memory. Because we never live exactly in the present. We're constantly replaying and stitching what just happened into a coherent narrative. That narrative becomes a training ground. After a hunt, people sat around fires thousands of years ago and retold every moment where the animal turned, where the ground gave way, where someone slipped, turning experience into shared rehearsal. Even now, after a near miss in traffic or a stumble on a trail, you find yourself reliving the event seconds later, adjusting how you might move if it happened again. The brain is using delay as a classroom, letting survival lessons echo and refine action for the next time. Storytelling itself may have been born from this rhythm. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have noted how tales of danger and escape are often told with vivid sensory detail, as though the teller is replaying the event in slow motion. Among the San people of southern Africa, hunters recount how an eland was followed across the Kalahari, each pause and gust of wind described. In Arctic communities, elders narrate encounters with thin ice or prowling bears with minute attention to sound and smell. These stories are not just entertainment but a way to extend the protective lag, to let others inhabit past events and carry them forward into their own predictions. Our nervous systems learn not just from what we survive, but from what we hear about others surviving. Modern science gives us a window into this ancient strategy. Experiments using IG and fMRI show that when we recall a memory, the brain replays patterns similar to those it produced during the original event, almost as if running a simulation. That rehearsal strengthens connections and fine-tunes prediction. Children who listen to family stories about near misses, a parent's childhood accident, a grandparent's close call build not just identity, but practical models of what to do when life goes wrong. Memory and narrative widen the buffer beyond an individual heartbeat, turning a half-second advantage into generational knowledge, even in complex modern life, where threats are less often lions in grass and more often speeding cars or sudden falls. This slight delay in its training value remain. Athletes talk about reading the play, a quarterback, watching defenders, and in a fraction of a second predicting where they will break. A tennis player guessing the opponent's serve direction before the ball leaves the racket. Soldiers and firefighters rely on a similar feel. Training drills repeat past emergencies so often that when the real crisis comes, their bodies move almost before awareness. But with purpose refined by countless rehearsed delays, the gift of this half-beat is not only reaction, but understanding. Because we lag slightly, we have room to interpret, to form meaning, to communicate. Language itself depends on time to integrate sound and prepare response. Conversation would collapse if we truly lived on the knife edge of each instant. Our delay allows listening, and listening allows learning. Perhaps this is why memory and survival are so bound together in human culture. We write diaries, we film events, we build museums of disaster and triumph, not just to mourn or celebrate, but to feed the brain's hunger for rehearsal. Each recorded moment lets us run the world again at safe remove, preparing for what might come. Even trauma, though painful, often leads the mind to replay in hope of mastery. Dreams can be understood as yet another theater for survival rehearsal. The brain taking yesterday's dangers and pushing them forward into tomorrow's protection. When you think about it, the very sense of self, the feeling that you are a continuous being moving through time, depends on this pause. Without the gap, life would be a barrage of unconnected flashes. With it, we have the grace to weave experience into story and action. We may not live in the present as purely as we imagine, but the small delay is the cost of wisdom and safety. So the next time you flinch before you know why, or find yourself telling a story about something frightening that just happened, remember what your brain is doing. It is turning distance into protection, buying a heartbeat's worth of safety, making a lesson out of danger, and passing it along. Living slightly behind, we are able to live it all. Pick up a photograph and hold it at arm's length. And you may feel for a moment as though you are looking directly into a present scene. But what rests inside that frame is already over. Photography has always promised to capture now, to trap a moment before it escapes, yet the act itself depends on delay. Light bounces from a face or a street or a battlefield, passes through glass, strikes a chemical plate or a digital sensor, and only then becomes the image you will later hold. By the time the shutter clicks and the picture exists, the living scene has already changed. The breath just drawn is released. The soldier's boot has shifted in the sand. The wave behind the boat has rolled on. From the first cameras, this truth shaped the art and the science. Louis Daguerre, whose daguerreotype process astonished Paris in 1839, needed minutes of exposure to record a street scene. Anything moving simply vanished or blurred because it was never there long enough for the silver to catch. A man standing for a portrait in the 1860s had to hold still while light slowly etched his face. And though the sitter imagined he was gifting the present, what he handed down was always a memory already formed. Even when exposures grew faster and shutters more precise, the gap remained. It only shrank to fractions of a second. That fraction can feel invisible until you look at history's most iconic images and realize how deeply they belong to the past. The famous photograph of U.S. Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima, taken by Joe Rosenthal on February 23, 1945. Seems alive with action. You feel the weight of the pole and the strain in the men's shoulders. But the event was already done when the negative cooled in Rosenthal's camera. The men themselves soon moved down the slope, some never leaving the island alive. The moment had slipped away even as the world came to know it as eternal. So it is with the blurred, salt-sprayed shots of today. Robert Capa, waist-deep in surf at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, tried to record the invasion as it happened. But each image was at least the time it took light to travel into his camera and film to register. More importantly, the men in his frames were already charging ahead. Some fell seconds after he pressed the shutter. His famous, slightly out-of-focus pictures are haunted by that truth, the present fleeing before it could be caught. Even the photograph of Earth taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts on December 24, 1968, known as Earthrise, is a gift from a world already moved. Light leaving our planet took about 1 1/3 seconds to reach the spacecraft. And by the time Bill Anders framed and shot the luminous blue and white sphere rising over the moon's horizon, the clouds had shifted, waves had broken, and people below had taken hundreds of breaths they would never know were being captured. All space photography works this way. The famous blue marble image of Earth from Apollo 17 in 1972 shows a living planet as it was some seconds before. And when we look at it now, we are staring across decades into a vanished instant. Modern cameras feel faster, but the illusion of immediacy still rests on delay. When you lift a phone for a selfie and smile, the tiny sensor behind the glass gathers light over milliseconds, then runs it through processors that balance exposure, smooth noise, and compress the file before showing you the picture. The version you see on the glowing screen is not the exact face you just made, but one caught. A small heartbeat earlier and then altered to please the eye. Live photos, burst modes, streaming video, all require buffering to avoid stutter and failure. Even live broadcasts on social media add seconds of lag for safety and stability. What you watch is never the raw, present moment, but something already wrapped and sent. Photographers themselves are deeply aware of this. Henry Cartier-Bresson, master of what he called the decisive moment, admitted that it was always past by the time the image was captured. His genius lay in predicting that instant and clicking just ahead of conscious awareness. War correspondents talk about a sixth sense, moving their hands before their minds register what is happening, because they know the camera can only follow, never truly lead. Sports photographers track athletes not where they are, but where they will be, to make up for the fraction of time between seeing and recording for viewers. The delay does not ruin the magic, but perhaps deepens it. To hold a photograph is to hold a sliver of time rescued from disappearance. It is not now, but it is a message from just after now. Proof that something happened and light carried it faithfully enough for us to revisit. When families gather around faded albums, they feel the life in those pictures even knowing it is long past. When people watch news images beamed from disaster zones, they respond emotionally to events already hours old, trusting the picture to stand in for a lost present. There's also a quiet warning here. Because photography always trails life, It can be shaped and edited to tell stories that never truly existed in the instant shown. Propaganda has long used still images to fix a narrative, counting on the viewer's instinct to believe a photograph is truth in the now. Yet the moment the shutter falls is already gone, and memory can be arranged as easily as pixels or prints. Even knowing this, we keep reaching for cameras, perhaps because the alternative is to let everything vanish unmarked. The gap between life and record is small enough that it comforts rather than frightens. We know our child's smile is already past when the image forms. But we take the picture anyway and feel that we have caught something alive. We know the astronaut's view of Earth was seconds behind, yet it moves us to see ourselves suspended in black space. To live as humans is to live just behind. And photographs make peace with that fact. They let us hold a vanished second close and pretend for a little while that we are still there. Even if every picture lies about being now, the lie is tender, a bridge across the delay that shapes all perception. Sit with a phone in your hand and watch the moving images that seem to connect you instantly to the world. And it feels as if you are living inside the same second as everyone else. A game-winning shot, a presidential speech, a rocket lifting away from its launch pad. They appear as if they are happening right before your eyes. Yet the truth is that even in this age of fiber optics and satellites, the moment you think is now is already gone. Digital life, despite all its claims of immediacy, is built on careful buffering compression, and rooting that slip time quietly out of reach. You can see this most clearly during live sports. Those events that promise raw present-tense excitement, but are stitched together behind the scenes. When millions tuned in to watch the 2018 FIFA World Cup final from Moscow or the Super Bowl in 2023, the cameras inside the stadium captured light and sound and converted them into digital signals. But before those signals reached living rooms and bars, they passed through layers of processing. Each frame of video was compressed into packets, checked, routed across servers, and sometimes delayed deliberately to avoid glitches or offensive content slipping through. Broadcasters insert a standard delay, often around 7 to 10 seconds, so producers can cut or bleep if needed. Even streaming platforms that boast real time often lag 30 seconds or more behind the stadium itself, especially when traffic is heavy. That is why someone watching on cable television may cheer before their friend watching on a phone. Here's the goal. The moment has become a staggered relay, paths scattered across screens. This slight drag is also built into the very networks carrying the signals. Under the oceans, data runs through fiber optic cables, thousands of miles long. Light travels fast, but not infinitely. Each repeater, each router, adds microseconds. Then compression and encryption add more. A single second might seem trivial, but it can decide the winner in a world where speed itself has become currency. Nowhere is that more true than in high-frequency trading, the hidden race on which global markets turn. Firms spend millions to shave microseconds off the time it takes to send a buy or sell order from one exchange to another. They lay private fiber routes between New York and Chicago, erect microwave towers across the Midwest because radio waves through air move slightly faster than light in glass, and even lease space inside exchange data centers to keep cables as short as possible. Yet no matter how aggressive the engineering, there is always some delay. By the time a price flashes on a trader's screen, it is an artifact. And the algorithms that act on it are already predicting rather than seeing. For ordinary users, this lag is invisible, but everywhere. Social media feeds, which sell themselves as windows into the immediate world, are constantly reorganizing and catching. A live video on Instagram or Facebook is held back a few seconds to smooth hiccups and avoid streaming collapse. Even short posts that seem to appear at once are routed through moderation and ranking systems. Your phone is not receiving the world raw, but a version of it that has been sorted and sometimes censored before you look. During breaking news, a fire, a protest, an earthquake, images and text spread fast. But they are always a chain of slightly stale reports. A tweet about an aftershock is seconds behind the ground's movement. A viral video from a street corner has already traveled through a camera roll, a compression algorithm, and a platform's servers before you tap play. The illusion of perfect now is reinforced by our device's speed. Push notifications, buzz, and banners slide across screens, and because they appear so quickly, we accept them as current. But look closer. The push is often built on polling cycles and queued delivery. A news app may check for updates every minute or two. A messaging service might retry packets if the connection wavers. Even a simple delivered mark can trail behind what actually happened. Your friends saw the message before you saw that they saw it. Yet, for most of us, the delays matter only when they break the story we want to believe. A friend texting from a stadium might post a video of a touchdown, and you will know the result before your own live stream shows it. A jarring reminder that your present is constructed. Traders spend fortunes because a handful of milliseconds means advantage. Journalists agonize when false tweets fill the gap before verified reports. But for everyday life, the smoothing works. The brain, built to predict and catch up, fills the short delay and leaves us feeling synchronous. There is irony in how digital technology has both shrunk and revealed this gap. When the first transatlantic cable carried news in hours instead of weeks, it felt miraculous. Now we complain about a 5-second lag on a video call. When early television relayed images across oceans, it came with huge latency and no one noticed. Now microseconds are measured and traded. We have grown used to the idea that everything can be instant, and so we feel each hiccup as betrayal. Still, understanding the truth can be oddly grounding. The so-called real-time feed is a carefully balanced act of engineering and editing. The match you watch is slightly older than it looks. The price you trade already passed, the message from a friend a blink behind their smile, and yet it works because we are built for it. Just as our eyes and ears tolerate neural lag, our digital lives tolerate network lag. We live inside a stitched present and rarely feel the seams. Every time you press go live or swipe to refresh, you are joining an ancient game of catch-up played with new tools. Light leaves a camera, crosses, switches, and satellites, reaches you later, and your brain nods and says, yes, this is now. The digital world cannot give you true immediacy, but it gives you something close enough that life can move and stories can unfold. Knowing that even our newest machines deliver the past may not change how we use them, but it can remind us to be cautious about the rush of information and gentle with the idea of being perfectly present. The digital now, like every now, is a little late, and that is how it has to be. There are hours when you wish you could stop the world and hold it still. Yet even the most powerful feelings prove how quickly the present slips away. When someone you love dies, there is a strange dislocation. You can sit in the same room they once filled and still feel them there, but you know the moment that contained them has vanished. Joy behaves in a similar way, though it feels warmer. At a wedding or a birth or a long-awaited reunion you think, let this stay forever. And yet even as the thought forms, the scene is already sliding backward. Nostalgia is perhaps the clearest evidence of this fragility. You remember a childhood summer, a smell of cut grass, a sound of bicycle spokes clicking, and the memory arrives as if alive. But the instant it describes is irretrievably gone. A ghost made of neurons replaying light that fell decades ago. Psychologists have long tried to map this fleeting sense of now. In the mid-20th century, researchers began to talk about the specious present, the small window of time the brain can hold as immediate experience. Some suggest it is only a few seconds wide, maybe up to 15 at the outer edge, before what you sense becomes memory and what you expect becomes prediction. William James wrote about this mental horizon in the 1890s, describing consciousness as a stream where each drop already contains the one before. Modern cognitive science adds detail. When you clap your hands, the sound you hear feels simultaneous but is actually blended with the fading moment before and the predicted echo after, stitched into a seamless now that never really existed. We are also wired with something called present bias, the tendency to weigh the immediate more heavily than the future. Behavioral economists like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky studied how people make choices, showing again and again that we favor rewards we can feel soon, even when waiting would be wiser. This bias comes from survival roots. In a dangerous world, a sure meal today mattered more than a possible feast next week. But it also distorts our sense of time's flow. We think the current moment is all-encompassing, only to discover later that it was a tiny piece. Grief can feel endless because the present pain blocks vision beyond it. Joy can trick us into thinking it will last, when in fact, the brain is built to move on. Future thinking complicates it further. Humans spend much of their mental life rehearsing what has not yet happened. Neuroscientists using fMRI have found that the same brain networks used for memory light up when we imagine tomorrow. To picture yourself in a future meeting or on a future vacation is to borrow from the past and project forward. It is a skill that helped our ancestors plan hunts and migrations, but it also means we rarely inhabit pure present tense. We are time travelers by design, slipping backward and forward so naturally that true now is more myth than fact. This fragility has sparked whole traditions trying to steady experience. Breathing exercises and mindfulness, though ancient in practice, have gained modern validation because they work with the brain's built-in delays. When you sit and notice a single breath, the cool air entering your nose and the warm air leaving, you are asking attention to settle on the closest thing to immediacy available, a rhythm that is happening while you observe it. Meditation teachers from Buddhist monasteries to contemporary clinical programs talk about the anchoring breath as a way to catch the mind before it drifts too far into memory or anticipation. Scientific studies at places like Harvard and Stanford show measurable effects. Participants who practice mindfulness reduce activity in the brain's default mode network, the circuitry tied to wandering through past and future, and increase activation in regions that support sensory presence. Yet even these efforts acknowledge impermanence. A meditation session is not a way to freeze time. It is a way to witness its passing without panic. Experienced practitioners speak of surfing the moment, knowing the wave cannot be held but can be ridden. Grief groups sometimes teach similar skills, guiding mourners to pause and feel a breath or a heartbeat as something solid when the rest of life feels like shifting sand. Therapists helping people with anxiety or depression often encourage grounding exercises. Feel your feet on the floor. Name the colors you see. Count slow inhales and exhales. These are small rebellions against the flood of remembered pain or imagined threat. Art and ritual have long served this human need to pause the drift. When we photograph a birthday cake, or write a line in a journal, or save a child's drawing on a refrigerator, we are not really saving now. We are admitting its escape and building a bridge back. Religions weave ceremonies for the same reason. Lighting a candle on an anniversary, ringing a bell at a funeral, repeating a prayer or mantra. All slow the rush just enough to let us catch breath and honor what has already passed. Technology tries its own version, though often without admitting the gap. Social media calls it stories and posts in the moment, but we know better. Each is a tiny echo, edited and delayed. Still we share because humans crave markers. A timeline or a feed is a modern campfire, place to replay and learn. Perhaps the deepest comfort comes not from chasing an impossible permanent now, but from understanding the rhythm and living with it. The present is fragile because it must be. Our survival depends on weaving memory and foresight, on rehearsing what might come and digesting what is gone. When grief surges, when joy glows and slips away, when nostalgia aches, it is the same system at work helping us adjust, endure, and stay alive in a moving world, so you can practice breathing slowly. You can tell stories, you can hold a photograph, and know it is only a shadow. These are all ways of caring for a mind that cannot truly stop time but can find steadiness inside its flow. The present moment may always be just out of reach, but learning to feel it pass without despair is its own kind of presence, gentle and human. Enough to keep going even when everything is already moving on. It begins with a simple but unsettling thought. By the time you notice anything, it is no longer there in quite the same way. The light that enters your eyes and builds the world around you left its source an instant or more before you recognized it. The sounds that shape a moment are already fading when you name them. Every step you take is on ground that has already changed underfoot. The present, so solid when you reach for it, dissolves like breath on cold glass. We have followed this thread across so many territories: the delay of the brain's own awareness, the slow return of echoes in canyons and deep seas, the lag of weather satellites and battlefield decisions, the quiet mercy of hesitation in a Cold War bunker. The way photographs hold what is already finished, and screens show a digital world always slightly behind itself. Each example leads to the same vanishing point. The more carefully you search for now, the more it runs ahead, leaving only traces that let you imagine its shape. And yet life is not diminished by this. It is made possible. The delay is not a failure, but a space for survival and meaning. Your nervous system takes that half second to gather signals so you do not stumble at every shadow. Memory unspools so you can learn and teach and avoid old dangers. Foresight fills the gap with prediction so you can catch a ball, dodge a car, plan a life. Even grief, with its painful awareness of how a moment slips away, exists because the mind can hold and revisit what it has lost, carrying lessons and love forward. The night sky shows this paradox in its clearest form. Look up and choose a single star. The pale, steady point above you may have sent its light long before you were born. In some cases, thousands of years before, the photons have traveled across gulfs so wide they seem without measure. And yet they arrive gently in your eye, giving you a present that is actually ancient. Sometimes the star itself is already gone, collapsed, or cooled, but you still receive its message. What you call now is full of these ghostly gifts: light, sound, touch, each arriving too late to be the moment, but close enough to make a moment. Your own body does the same. Place a hand over your chest and feel the heartbeat. The thump you sense is a wave that passed through tissue and nerve before you became aware. By the time you register it, another beat is on its way. Life is already moving forward while you linger a step behind. That small distance is not loss. It is the rhythm of being alive. This understanding can feel frightening at first, as if nothing can ever be grasped. But there is another way to hold it, as an invitation to witness rather than clutch. To know that the present cannot be captured frees you to experience it as it flows, without demanding it stay still. When you listen to a friend speak, you are hearing just past words, yet the connection is real. When you watch the sea, every wave you name is gone, but the watching is true. When you breathe slowly and feel the air move, you are not freezing time, but noticing it pass, and in noticing, you inhabit it. Mindfulness teachers and poets have long circled this point. The breath is anchor, the step is practice, the soft gaze on a star. Each is a way of saying yes to a living echo. The call is not to fight delay, but to trust it. You do not need to arrive before your own senses. You only need to arrive with them. The echo is enough to live by. So as this long journey ends, imagine one last picture. A lone observer standing in a field under a cold, clear night, stars scattered in every direction. Somewhere far away, light is leaving suns you will never know. Somewhere close, a heart beats and sends its signal upward. The observer looks, listens, breathes. The moment is gone before it can be named, but the witnessing remains. It's quiet and whole. You cannot hold now, but you can live inside its afterglow. That is what we all do. Build lives from the shimmering tale of passing time, love from vanished seconds, safety from remembered danger, joy from echoes of laughter, already faded. The present moment is always slipping beyond reach, yet in its wake, there is a path wide enough for awareness, wonder, and care. To understand that is not to lose the present, but to finally see how it works, a vanishing point that invites you to follow. Not to fear.